Another property that we have to understand about muscles is known as the length-tension relationship. So if you guys think about what you did in class when your arm was fully extended and you had your wrist at 0 degrees, you generated generally the maximum amount of grip strength. So the maximum tension was generated in those muscles. When you kind of flexed your wrist upward to what we were calling the positive 40-degree angle, for most people, and again, the dynamometer that we used was a little bit, the scale was a little bit limited. So some people did max it out. But in general, you'll find that people's grip strength goes down as they kind of flex their wrist up. And alternatively, if you go in the other direction and you kind of flex your wrist down, so you have like a negative 40-degree angle, the grip strength weakens as well. So what you can see in the graph here is that general relationship. So in this case, the sarcomere length of between 2 and 2.25 micrometers, that more or less represents the situation where you had your wrist basically unflexed. So you had 0 degree angle. So at that situation, your sarcomeres are more or less in like a neutral position. So there's some space between the Z line and the myosin. You'd have actin up here as well, but they're just showing the bottom portion down here. And one of the reasons you generate the most tension there is if you take a look, you have maximum cross bridge formation here because the myosin heads are able to grab onto the actin, and you'll notice that every single myosin head is able to grab onto that actin and pull on it. So if I take a look here, that portion where you are a little bit further away, that would be like when you, in this case, flexed your wrist upwards. So the fibers in the bottom of your forearm, they were being extended. So as you started to extend those sarcomeres, you basically pulling the Z lines apart to the point where you actually started to slide the actin filaments far enough apart that the myosin heads could not all make contact with that actin fiber and then start to pull. So if we look at this image here, all of these myosin heads that are essentially out here in open space, they have nothing to grab onto. So the tension being generated here is really only by the myosin heads that are at whatever this point of overlap is. So the further you extend those muscle fibers, the further you stretch those Z lines, the less you're going to get in terms of the cross bridge formation, because you literally will just have myosin heads that are not in contact. They can't reach the actin fiber at that point. So that's why when you extend upwards, and again, talking about like the bottom of your forearm, the extension there causes the Z lines to move far enough apart, makes the actin filament slide enough that the myosin heads, not all of them can actually reach. So you get less tension there, less force generation because you have less cross bridge formation, less of those myosin heads can grab onto the actin and then pull it. In the middle section, as I started to mention, you have really nice overlap. So all of those heads are working together. They can form many cross bridges. There's some room to slide, so they can keep kind of like a tug of war. You can go hand over hand. So the myosin heads can attach, and then detach, attach, and then detach, and they can continue to do that. Because there's still sufficient room here. Now, when you extend your wrist downwards and you actually compress those, if you compress the sarcomeres enough, you actually run into a situation where the Z lines are basically butting up against the myosin fibers. So you kind of start to get everything jammed together. You don't really have any more room to be moving. So the myosin heads can no longer kind of detach and then reach forward a little bit and then attach again and pull. You basically run out of room. So it's less about not being able to form enough cross bridges, and it's more about the fact that you've run out of room. So when the myosin heads go to pull forward, everything's kind of stuck because you've got those Z lines that are kind of butted up against the myosin fiber. So you've essentially run out of room. So you'll start to have a drop off there as well. For the opposite reason, you'll have a drop off on that other side simply because you don't have any more room, so you can't continue to pull these fibers. They can't continue to slide anymore, so it becomes less efficient, and you have some drop off there. So the reason for this curved kind of pathway essentially has to do with a combination of how much overlap is there between the actin and the myosin fibers, because the more that the myosin heads can form cross bridges with the actin, the more tension you will generate. And then in terms of like a lot of compression of that sarcomere, you do eventually run out of room where there's just no more room to continue moving forward. So you basically have some of the myosin heads trying to pull forward, but then the ones that are near the M lines, like they don't really have anywhere to go. So you have a little bit of a drop off in terms of how many myosin heads are actually pulling on the actin fiber. You also, it might be hard to see here, but you can see that in this case, the actin fibers, there's one on top of the other. So before you had, all of the myosin heads pulling on two different actin fibers, whereas in this case with some overlap, you kind of almost have like less, I almost want to say like less surface area that's in contact with the actin fibers to some extent. So you have all of these pulling essentially on one actin fiber as opposed to two. So that's another reason you get a little bit of less efficiency. But essentially, you're running out of room. There's the overlap of the actin, so there's not as many like binding sites that they can latch onto, that kind of thing. All right, so you just need to understand in terms of this relationship that in like the neutral position, that's when you still have room between the Z lines and the myosin fibers. You also have enough cross bridge formation, so each of those myosin heads can grab onto the actin, so everything's working together, and that's why you generate the most tension. As things separate, you start to lose the number of cross bridges that can be formed because the actin fibers they slide far enough that there's not as many myosin heads that can be in contact with them. And likewise, when you compress, you kind of get the opposite problem. You run out of room, so the myosin heads near the ends, near the Z lines, there's really nowhere for them to kind of reach forward and grab onto. You've got some overlapping of the actin fibers, so there's a variety of reasons why all that kind of compression of the sarcomere kind of leads to some inefficiencies there. The only other thing that we need to understand about length and tension, or the length-tension relationship, is something that's known as active versus passive tension. So to a certain extent, if you really think about it, if we begin to extend these sarcomeres, as you can see is happening like with these diagrams, right? Everything's kind of bunched up, so that's why we have like your low force. As things start to go back towards like that neutral position, we're getting more force. You get your maximum when everything's kind of in that ideal neutral state. Then we start to go a little bit too far, so now there's some myosin heads that have nothing to latch onto, so we start to lose some more force. I'm going to follow this dotted line now. I'll explain this curve in a second. And then as we fully kind of separate them, you are not generating any more force because you don't have any overlap between those myosin heads and the actin fibers. But what you'll notice is even when we get to that point, you still have tension in the muscle. So what we have to be aware of is you've lost what we call active tension, and that gets replaced with passive tension. So the active tension curve is here, and I'll explain what that is in a second. And you have the passive tension curve here, and the red line is the combination. So in the very beginning, you have no passive force. I'm just kind of defining what's going on here in this graph. You have no passive force, and I'll explain why in a second. The active force is increasing as you're kind of getting that more efficient sarcomere arrangement. You kind of max out, then you start to kind of pull things a little bit too far in a manner of speaking. And then the actual tension being generated by those sarcomeres will start to drop because you don't have the ability at this point to form any of those cross bridges. But just as the active tension is decreasing, that's when passive tension starts to increase. And that's why you get this kind of inverse curve here. So you first start to drop, but then as active tension is decreasing, it's replaced by passive tension. And that's what that red line is, the combination. So the active tension is the tension in what we call the contractile components of the muscle. So the components like the sarcomeres that are actually generating contraction, that's what we call the active tension. So that's why in this image here, the active tension starts to drop once the actin and the myosin get kind of separated a little bit too far. So the active tension starts dropping because the sarcomeres themselves physically cannot cause a high enough tension in contraction due to that kind of inefficiency that we discussed previously. Passive tension, on the other hand, is the tension that you'll get from the non-contractile components. So epimysium, paramysium, the portions that kind of hold the muscle together but are not actively able to contract and create tension. They will begin to generate tension if you stretch them far enough. So imagine, if you will, maybe, I don't know if this is the greatest example, but let's say you took a bunch of rubber bands and you put them inside of a balloon. and then you grab like a big balloon. You grab the ends of the balloon. You didn't blow the balloon up; it's deflated. You grab the ends of the balloons and you kind of feel the rubber bands inside, and you start to pull. Well, when we first start to pull, you're essentially going to have the rubber bands inside of that balloon stretching and stretching, but there'll still be some slack in the balloon itself. So I'll basically be pulling the rubber bands apart, and I will be stretching the balloon a little bit. But the more I begin to stretch as the slack gets taken out of the balloon, I will hit a point where now all the slack is gone. And now as I stretch the balloon, it's going to start to kind of resist and cause some tension pulling back. So as I start to pull even more and more, I'll initially only have tension in the rubber bands on the inside because there's still slack in the balloon. And that's kind of like what's going on here. You have tension in the sarcomeres and the muscle fibers, but you don't really have too much tension in like the epimysium, the paramecium, because they really haven't gotten to this point where they're like stretched to the point where they're going to create tension. But as I continue to stretch, you'll eventually get to the point where the rubber bands inside are stretching and the actual surface of the balloon is stretching as well. So now they're both creating tension. And that's where this passive tension comes in. You've separated things enough that now there's tension being generated in like the sheaths that cover the muscle and cover the fibers. And then that begins to resist that pull. So it tends to line up more or less. You begin to lose the active tension as the passive tension starts to increase. So the overall tension curve of muscle has kind of like this interesting shape. And the reason that curve kind of inflects and then begins to go back up is you have this period of time where you're losing some of the tension because the sarcomeres are now kind of stretched enough that the actin and the myosin can interact, but that begins to be replaced as the actual like sheath covering the muscle and the fibers. Now that's been stretched enough that whatever slack was in there is pretty much gone. And now that is almost acting like an elastic membrane that's trying to pull everything back together. So that's where that shift comes from active to passive tension. So worth noting, just because as you extend the muscle, you do get kind of this interesting downward curve inflected to an upwards curve. And that doesn't have anything to do with the sarcomere. It has to do entirely with the fact that the tension being generated is now really being generated by the non-contractile components, like the elasticity of those muscle sheaths, as the actual sarcomeres start to produce less tension. So just understand, if I just gave you a tension versus sarcomere length, this interesting curve here is not entirely because of the sarcomere. Once you get to the second inverted curve, it's no longer really tension because of the sarcomeres, or not nearly as much. It's being replaced with the elasticity of those non-contractile components. So that's the extent to what you need to understand about the length-tension relationship. So do what you can with it. Any questions you have as you're going through making corrections on your activity or whatnot, either email me them or just make a note and then stop by on Monday, or stop by when you can with any questions you might have. Otherwise, if this was clear enough, great. You can make whatever adjustments you need, and we will talk about it on Tuesday. Good luck.